All right, hello. This is the second video of our real-time top-down combat system that we're working on. The first one was the health and inventory. Now we're going to do spawn points for enemies and players, as well as some of the methods that are going to be on the characters, like taking damage, killing enemies, resetting the character, and so on. Just as a reminder, you can find all of this in the tutorial class assets, tutorials, real-time top-down combat, and then this is where all the scripts are going to be, so you guys don't have to suffer and you can look at the scripts from here. Of course, I'll be explaining everything. Then this also has links to the videos, which are just going to be like on a private YouTube channel so that people don't have to download videos and whatnot. But the link to this one will be in there as well as the old one. So I'll go ahead and get started. I have the book here. It looks like it wants us to start by making a game manager. We already have a game manager. If you don't have that, that's going to be in there. Just make sure that if you already have it and made changes, just be cognitive of that. Right now, it's just a singleton, which means there's only one that persists through scenes. And we check if there's one that already exists before we instantiate, which we do on the main objects loader, which we should already have. We do that right here. We check if the instance is null. If not, if it is, then we make one. If it's not, then we don't make one. And then don't destroy unload means that it's going to persist through scenes. So we should only have this one throughout the entire gameplay experience, which is what makes it a singleton. This book is spawning the player from the game manager, which is fine. We're spawning our player and spawning everything from our main objects loader script. So we'll just spawn the player from here. This is what we're doing. This is how we spawn the player, by finding the game object called player start in our scene hierarchy. This is a fairly fragile way of doing it because it relies on every scene having an object called player start exactly. And it's also can be expensive if you have a lot of objects in the scene because it cycles through all of the objects in the scene looking for this player start object. So if you have hundreds of objects, it might be laggy. So I like the way that the book does it. It's very simple and it's very reliable. So I'm going to highlight all of this and press Control / to comment it out. And I'm just going to check if this recording is still going. Yes, because this laptop sometimes it interrupts. But okay, so they're making the game manager, and then they're going to make these spawn points where we're actually going to spawn the player and enemy. So let's go back to Unity and make a spawn points, which is going to be a prefab. I'm just going to right click in the hierarchy and click create empty and call it spawn point. And then I'm going to make a script in my combat scripts folder called spawn point, which you have here. If you haven't done that, go ahead and do that. A script called spawn point, and then open it up. And this is what it looks like. This is going to be in the class folder for this tutorial. What it's doing is we're inserting in the inspector a prefab to spawn. This at first we're going to put our player in there, then enemies, and the repeat interval is going to be how often we want the enemies to spawn. So for players, this is always going to be 0. So basically, at the start, it checks if the repeat interval is greater than 0. And if it is, then it's going to call this invoke repeating method, which we get from the using system collections namespace, which basically calls this method as a string, which is going to be this. So basically, it's going to call this, and it's going to call it between intervals that we set from this variable, which we'll set in the inspector. So if you're making like a zombie style game where enemies spawn every 10 seconds or whatever, this is how you're going to do that. Maybe you don't want a spawn system like that. That's how we're going to do it to start, but you could also call this spawn object, when you kill an enemy, another enemy spawns, or however you want to do it, right? So this is the method that we're actually calling. It checks if we have a prefab to spawn in there, and if so, then we instantiate that prefab at the position of this object, which is going to be on our spawn point prefab, and I believe this is going to be for the rotation of the object, and that's how that works. So save that and go back to Unity. Recording is still going, great, and we're going to add component, add the spawn point component. And to start, I'm going to go to my player prefab and add that in the input field, make sure the repeat interval is set to 0, and then I'm going to set this spawn point in the scene. But I can't really see where it is because it doesn't have a sprite, so I'm going to go to the top left of the inspector and set the icon to something blue. And then I'm going to set the spawn point in the scene. But I can't really see where it is because it doesn't have a sprite, so I'm going to go to the top left of the inspector and set the icon to something blue. And set the icon to something blue. And if you saved your main objects loader, actually, yeah, we have to actually, because we took away the old way of spawning the player. So we're going to make the new way of spawning the player. Um, so I added this line up here, the public spawn point. This is where we're actually going to put the spawn point so that our main object loader has a reference to it. And this is just a much more solid way of doing it than finding it by name, because it doesn't have to look through all of the objects in the scene. And then we're going to call this setup scene, and we make sure that we call this in the awake function, because we want the player to spawn technically before anything else in the game spawns, because everything else in the game is reliant on having the player there, such as our camera controller. It needs a player to follow, and some other things that we made as well. So the setup scene method basically is going to check if our player it's going to check if we don't have a player or not, and if we don't have a player, then it's going to call this. So make sure you add this, and make sure you add this. And this is just going to check if we have a player spawn point and then spawn our player. So I'm going to save that and then go back to Unity, and then on your main objects loader, hit this spawn point that we just made into that input field. And I'm going to turn this into a prefab as well. And then I'm going to test it out. I think that's all we need to do. Sweet, so that works. And then my UI canvas is blue because I am using this on a different computer from my office instead of my house. So I'm going to figure that out. All right, so next we're going to make the enemy spawn. For the enemy prefab, right now I'm just going to make a sprite for the enemy. So I imported some enemy sprites. Right now I have the cranky crab. I'm going to right click, create empty cranky crab. Add a sprite renderer component. And I'm going to drag in one of these and set the sorting layer to, going to add a sorting layer for enemies that's above the objects layer and set it to that. So that's going to be my enemy for now. I'm going to go ahead and add the enemy script that we made before to it as well. And I'm going to turn this into a prefab. So my enemy is now prefab. And now I'm going to make a empty object in my hierarchy and call it spawn points, because I'm about to make a bunch of spawn points and they're all going to be in this folder object. So I'm going to drag another spawn point into my scene and another spawn object into my scene. And then I'm going to delete the cranky crab prefab, go into these new spawn points that I just made. I'm going to rename them enemy spawn point. And I'm going to change their icon to red. And then for the prefab to spawn, I'm going to drag in my cranky crab enemy. And I'm going to make sure that I don't hit apply, because I don't want this to affect the other spawn point prefabs. And then I'm going to set the interval for testing purposes to something short like 3. And I'm going to press play and see if it works. All right, so it spawns 2 of them, and it's spawning another 2. And every 3 seconds, it's spawning another one. Can't really see it because they're on top of each other. Enemies aren't really doing anything. I believe that's going to be the next step. All right, that's all good to go. Now let's make these characters actually do things. So I'm going to open up the character class, which is the parent class, as you may recall, to our enemy and player. And because our enemies don't actually need hit points as scriptable objects to keep track of their HP, we're going to do that with a float instead. So I'm going to remove the hit points from the character class, just add that to the player class, which I did right here. I added the public hit points at the top of the player class. And then I'm going to go to the enemy class and remember to make sure that it derives from character instead of mono behavior. so that it has access to all of this. And then I'm just going to add the float hit points, which is the only thing we're keeping track of for the enemy right now, is how many hit points it has. Save that, go back to the character class, and let's see. Then both of these are going to have the public virtual void kill character. Virtual void just means that you can overwrite it in the subclasses if you need to. So if the player kill character has to do something differently, we can do that. Right now it's just destroying the game object. It's the simplest way of doing it. If you want to spawn it later after it dies, you probably want to disable it instead of destroy it, because you can't call anything from destroyed game objects or disabled objects. But you could disable like a child of it. But this will do for now, and then I might as well explain these two. These are two abstract voids that both of the subclasses will have. Reset character just restarts the character back to how it began, and damage character is self-explanatory. They're both abstract, which means we cannot call them from the class that they're on, but only from subclasses, and the subclasses must have these methods if they are going to if the game's going to compile and run. All right, now let's actually make the characters do things. I'm on the enemy script right now. Up here, I added the public void on enable method, which means that it's going to be called when the object is activated or enabled. That's calling the reset character method, which we'll get to in a little bit. I also added the damage character IEnumerator. An IEnumerator is something that's called, it's basically what you're going to use for anything that's time-based, because it slows down the execution of your code. So in here we have a while loop, which is looping through until our hit points is less than 0. So in this first line, our hit points equals our current hit points minus damage, which we set up here. And then if our hit points goes below, if it's less than or equal to float.epsilon, which is 0. Apparently Unity is prone to rounding errors, so epsilon just means the smallest value that is greater than 0. If we go less than that, we call the kill character method. If our interval is greater than 0, then we wait for it to reach 0. Otherwise, this thing breaks, and this is never called. So we can never be just taking a bunch of damage from an enemy, because we're going to call this method while we're colliding with an enemy or colliding with lava or whatever you want to do. And then we have the public override void reset character, which just resets our hit points to starting hit points, which is going to be set when our enemy is enabled. So that's what our enemy is going to do. On the player script, I went down here and added 3 things down here. So first we added the damage character IEnumerator, which is the same exact thing as the enemy damage character, and then we added an override void, which is going to override the base class kill character method. But we actually get the kill character method from the base character class, which is what this base is doing, which is just destroying the game object. Then we also destroy the health bar.game object. And if you remember, we actually have our inventory on that object as well. So this is going to destroy our health bar and our inventory, which is fine. And then we are going to call this reset character method. But everything that we're doing in this awake function, we're actually going to want to do, I'm going to steal that from there and put that in the reset character function. And I actually don't know where we're going to call this yet, because I haven't gotten there yet. All right, now all we have to do is store the collision logic for our enemy. On the enemy script, I added this public integer damage strength at the top for our amount of damage we're going to do to the player, and then I added this coroutine damage coroutine where we're going to store the IEnumerator right here, damage character, and determine whether or not it's still going or not, so that we know whether or not we want to damage the player. So I added those 2 variables at the top, and then I have these 2 collision methods. So on collision enter 2D and exit 2D. So this is going to handle what happens when we run into the enemy, because this is on the enemy script when enemy prefab, and if the glider that hits it has the player tag, then it will run this logic. it will get our player component, and then if the coroutine is still going, or rather if the coroutine isn't still going, if it's null, then we will call the damage character method from our player object. And we use these parameters for the arguments, the damage strength that we set on this specific enemy, and the time between each hit, the interval. For the exit method, we do the same thing. We check if it's the player, and if the coroutine is not still going, then we stop it when we leave the trigger of the enemy, because we're no longer touching him anymore. And then on the player script, I added this reset character method that we put at the bottom. I just put that back into the awake method so we can make sure that that's going. And then one more thing that I had to do for our game specifically was make sure that our camera isn't still looking for the player once the player dies. So I added this if player is not null around the camera following line that we have here. So if the player doesn't exist, then we are not going to do this. So then I save all of those scripts, go back to Unity Editor. I find my enemy prefab and Mr. Cranky Crab. And the enemy script should look like this. So for testing purposes, I put the max HP to 2 and the starting hit points to 2 and damage strength to 1. And then you're also going to want to add a collider to it. So I added a circle collider and changed the size like that. And then we should be all set to test it out. So right now I have 60 HP. When I run into the enemy, it went down to 40. Alright, I actually ended up adding a flash effect for when the player gets hit because I feel like it really needs that. So I'm going to show you guys how to do that really quickly. In the scripts folder, in my combat scripts, I made a new script called Simple Flash. And then I also made a materials folder with a flash material. And I did that by right-clicking, create material, name it flash_m or something. And then I went to the shader at the top and GUI and then text shader. And then I just left it as white. So whenever we switch the material on our player sprite renderer to this, it will render as completely white. So now I'm going to go back and open up that script that I made, the Simple Flash script. And this is what it looks like. This is going to be in the tutorial folder. And this is basically this is just something that I found online. That's going to switch the material of our player by calling this flash method. So basically we want to call this whenever we get hit. And if you recall, we get hit on our player script in the damage character enumerator. So first we're going to need to get a reference to that flash component by making a serialized private simple flash, by making it into a variable up here. And then we call it right here, flash effect dot flash. Just make sure that it's outside of the conditional statement, and then save, and then go back to Unity. And then on your player prefab, you can add the simple flash script component. And then on your script, and then on your player component, drag that component into the flash effect field. And then that should work. Let's see. When I run into the enemy now, I do a little flash. And then if I stay there, I keep flashing and then I die. So that already looks a lot better. And now you can see how easy it is to add things. Like you probably should add a sound effect. Maybe you could instantiate some kind of blood spatter or something, or a hit effect. The sky's the limit. All right, that's it for now.